So, welcome to this special session of the Heidegger and Classical Thought Reading Group. We're very fortunate to have both of the translators of Heidegger's 1935 lecture series, Einführung in die Metaphysik, the Introduction to Metaphysics. Here with us today, Professor Greg Fried and Professor Richard Polt. And they've kindly agreed to share their experiences of translating the text, which is, of course, the subject of this year's reading group, and Heidegger more broadly. So I'm going to start proceedings with a couple of general introductory questions, and then I'm going to open the floor for the group to pose more questions, their questions. So to jump right in, so you mentioned in your introduction to the first edition of your translation that Manheim's translation is showing its age, which I think I agree with, and most people would agree with as well. Whereas a new translation, which 40 years later, would be better served to tap into what you call the broad consensus for rendering key concepts in Heidegger's philosophical lexicon that has developed in that time. I wonder then if you could elaborate on that point with some examples of where Mannheim's translations had most obviously fallen behind the consensus. The most obvious one, I suppose, is his translation of Zion as essence. But I realize we're airing into the weekly territory of the Daseinde debate, which dominates every other session. So other examples would be welcome. And I suppose on the flip side of that, I'd ask, you mentioned, of course, that the consensus shouldn't dictate the work of the translation. So I wonder where you both think the consensus potentially becomes problematic or even obscures at times Heidegger's meaning as you see it, and how you addressed any such issues in your translation.
Well, I could begin, I guess. I have here that this is how it all began with Greg and I reading this Manheim translation in the 80s in graduate school. And we started to check the German and realized, well, sometimes he's a little loose and sometimes we think he's wrong. And then this began this dream of making our own translation someday. And that I was going through our old files. That began back in 1991. I wrote to Yale, and then they expressed some interest, and Greg agreed to join me. And then we spent most of the 90s, sporadically working on this thing. And here we are in 2024. So it's been a very long time. So I went through this. I still have our marginal notes back from the 80s when we, big question marks in the margin, that sort of thing. And,
I have my copy of it too here.
Oh, very good. Hello. It's not a disaster or anything. It's really a very good translation for the most part. But one thing is, of course, Dasein. And he says in his introduction that he wants to, instead of leaving it untranslated, just translate it as being there, which is reasonable, except that then sometimes it's not being there. Sometimes it's existence, and sometimes it's human life or something. And so you just can't tell what the word is. Another example that I found going through this is where Seinsverständnis is translated here as awareness of being, which is not terrible, but nobody else has done this. And ever since Macquarie and Robinson, it's understanding of being. So that's what we did. What else? Well, essence, I think those are the big ones. Greg?
No, those are the big ones. And I would invite the folks here today to look at the glossary of our edition at the back and think about whether there are any specific words that we rendered that you would like to know more about our decision to do it that way. And as much as possible, we were, nice cat, we were trying to coordinate with the existing lexicon in Heidegger scholarship at the time. But we didn't want to be slavish to it either. I wonder if people might like to know a little bit more about our method in translating and how we did it. That might intrigue people. It's worth saying that when Richard and I first read Introduction to Metaphysics together, it was when I did not know Heidegger. And it was in I think the winter break of 1987. And I visited Richard at his home in Oakland, California, and we just sat in a room and would read out line by line to each other the English translation. And Richard had the German Niemeyer version with him and would be checking the German. I did not yet know German. And so we really went through it line by line, word by word, and I would be asking questions about, well, what does this mean? What does that mean? Because I was learning Heidegger by reading this book. And that's how we made all these discoveries about problems in the translation. And the problems weren't just looseness of translation. There were also concrete lapses, for example, where Manheim would drop portions of sentences. And what I thought of as distorting translations. So when Heidegger speaks of der Führer, Manheim translates it as the chancellor. And that just takes a certain edge off, which I don't think should have been taken off at the time.
Yeah, that's a great example. Here's another little one where it's less outrageously political, but in a discussion of Nietzsche, and this is Niemeyer 28, Mannheim says, the task consists, first of all, if we are to gain a true grasp of Nietzsche, in bringing his accomplishment to a full unfolding. Okay, but what he translated as grasp is Angriff, and it doesn't really mean grasp, it means an attack.
Yeah.
So we have the task consists in fully unfolding that which was realized through Nietzsche by means of a truly engaged attack on him. That's what we think Heidegger meant, and Mannheim just softened that for some reason.
Well, I think there's actually a research project to be done on the early translations of Heidegger into English, because Introduction to Metaphysics was the first book-length work of Heidegger's that was translated into English before Being in Time. I believe that the Elucidations of Hölderlin were translated before, but I think for a larger audience, that's a pretty marginal work. So this is a very important work of Heidegger's. Heidegger himself, in the new edition of Being in Time in 1953, says, if you want to know what I meant by being in time, look at Introduction to Metaphysics. And then that's the first book that's translated into English. And this is during a period when Hannah Arendt and John Glenn Gray are in close contact with Martin Heidegger and thinking about how are we going to bring Heidegger into the English-speaking world. So I don't know how closely Arendt or Gray were looking over the shoulders of Manheim, and it would be interesting to know if there's any correspondence or discussion of that. But again and again in the Manheim translation, he is doing things that take the edge off the text, if I can put it that way. Like in the passage that Richard just said, instead of grasp, it really should be attack. And instead of the Führer, it becomes the Chancellor. So I do wonder if some of the decisions that are being made are to make Heidegger more palatable to an English-speaking audience and to depoliticize him, or at least make him a little less controversial, sound a little bit more like other existentialist writers of the time. So that
another
acceptable.
I don't know whether this is a big one, but there's the word folk. And
Yeah.
sometimes Mannheim translates it as people, but sometimes as nation. And so you can't really quite track it. And nation, it's easy not to realize that is that loaded word folk. We translated it as people consistently.
Yeah.
some people seem to believe that it's untranslatable. You just have to leave it in German. I don't think that's true, but
Yeah, that goes too far, I
Yeah.
think. One wants to minimize that sort of thing in translation. Of course, the word Dasein is an extraordinary exception, but yeah, I don't like leaving things in the German. So when Richard and I began working on the translation itself, it really was the work of a decade. And then again, when we did the second edition, we used the process that I'm going to describe to you all over again to go through the whole text. Our process was this. We would divide up the text into short slices, and one or the other of us would translate that slice. Then we'd send it to the other person to review and make suggestions on. Then the first person who translated the slice would reflect and incorporate or flag for discussion those suggestions. And then we would meet and discuss it line by line, word by word again. And we would keep careful track as we were translating of our solutions to different translation problems, not just conceptual words in Heidegger's conceptual vocabulary, but just solutions to translating German idiom or the way that Heidegger uses his German to express himself so that we could be consistent in how we dealt with that. When we ran into a serious translation problem about a term, and we can talk about some of the terms that we found most challenging. We are using we're writing it in an electronic file. So if we made a decision that we wanted to change a rendering of a word, what we could do is search our entire translation and go back through it and think through, well, does this new idea work here and here and here and here? And then work that through in the whole text.
Yeah,
At
because we
the
wanted to
end,
be consistent when we could
yeah,
so that people could trace the use of a particular word. But sometimes you do have to use 2 or 3 different English words.
yeah, and I think we track that in the glossary
Right.
where we decided we couldn't just use one rendering intelligibly in English. And then when we were done with that sectioning process of the text, we would sit down with one another and simply read the whole thing through again, line by line, to try to perfect the English rendering so that it would be as intelligible in English as we could make it. Often our first passes would be very literalistic so that we could be sure we weren't missing anything. When we were going over it for the second, third, or fourth time, we would be trying to render it into more intelligible English, more normal English, as far as was possible without losing Heidegger's meaning. And iteration over iteration, I think we got it as far as we could go. And then, of course, when we did the second edition, we just did that all over again.
Yeah,
So
there weren't a huge number of changes, but I have that copy too that we both wrote in the margins of. And frequently there are little changes where things that we felt originally, needed to be very Heideggerian, we realized, this is not quite so necessary. For instance, ursprünglich, that was a major change. We had originary in the first one, and I remember my wife looking on it in one of our efforts, I think when we were all physically together, and she said, "That's not an English word." And we said, "Well, sure it is. It's used in Heidegger translations." But on the second edition, we thought, you know what, the word original is just fine.
that's right. So it's very hard when one's a non-native German speaker and one has immersed oneself into Heidegger, it's very hard not to get caught up in the intensity of involving oneself in Heidegger's very specific idiom, and then to forget that one actually now needs to write in English. And I think of that as a really interesting philosophical problem. And that's what made the work Richard and I did together worthwhile at every step of the way. First of all, Richard's a very good friend, and so it was enjoyable to work with him. But translation, especially of a great thinker like Heidegger, is itself philosophical work. It's not the kind of philosophical work you can get tenure with, but it is the kind of philosophical work that one can really enjoy and learn a tremendous amount from. Not only because it forces you to think through very carefully the conceptual vocabulary of the thinker, but also because it pushes you into what I call metatranslation. And what I mean by that, and I talk about it a lot in my translating groups that I'm part of, is there's a point in any work of translation, and this could just be everyday translation from one language to another, where you just simply cannot rely on a literal rendering and a grammatical rendering of the words in one language and convey what is meant by what has been said in that language into the other one. And therefore, one has to engage in what I'm calling metatranslation, which is what is the author trying to say that is in some way beyond the words on the page. And to me, that's a fascinating philosophical problem where somehow we're meant to get to a meaning that is present, like the spirit in the words, but goes beyond the words themselves. And we all know, if you've ever done language work, we all know that that will happen sometimes, that you can't possibly understand something by being, no matter if you knew the grammar, if you know the vocabulary, you have to do something different to express what's going on in that
Here,
sense.
I have an example if you want.
Yeah.
So Manheim actually mentions this in his translator's note. He says, if Heidegger had been at home in English, this less spiritual language, he would have written and thought differently. It does little good to ask how he would have said, in sich aus sich hinausstehen in my language. But then, of course, he has to try to translate that. And what he does, this is page 14 of his translation, he translates it as inward jutting beyond itself. And we thought, well, okay, nice try, but that doesn't really make any sense given our interpretation of what Heidegger is trying to say. And so we came up with, let's see if I can find that. I think it was intrinsic something or other. Oh yes, standing out in itself from itself, which is pretty close to just in sich aus sich hinausstehen. But this is an example of the hermeneutic circle where you have to interpret each particular word and sentence in terms of your overall sense of what Heidegger is trying to think. And then, of course, it can work the other way around, where maybe you discover something in your detailed work that shifts your interpretation of the whole. So not every word requires that level of philosophical reflection, but some of them certainly do.
I suppose the thing that interests me, and I'm not even sure how I can express it well, but where does thinking go when it thinks what needs to be expressed that is beyond one language and now needs to go into another language? It means that language, although it is a vehicle for understanding, there is an understanding that also transcends language. I find that enormously paradoxical. Gadamer calls it the miracle of understanding. And it, to me, one of the really fascinating things about doing translating work is those moments where the miracle of understanding comes to the fore and one really sees it through the work of thoughtful translation. Now, when you're doing a scholarly translation, as we did of Heidegger, you have to be very, very economical with meta-translation. I think it's something that one can do in the classroom when trying to explain Heidegger, or maybe in writing one's own work on Heidegger, or writing one's own work in phenomenology that is inspired by Heidegger. But when one's writing a scholarly book, one really is constrained to coordinate with the existing literature so that people who are reading the translation are not mystified by what you've done, and it can be helpful to the English-speaking scholarly world, and also that you are demonstrably tethered to the original text.
Yeah,
So,
and in response to part of Aaron's question, I couldn't think of an example where we deviated really from an established tradition of Heidegger translation. We were leery of doing that.
yeah, so there was a kind of dual constraint that we tried to abide by, which was to be literal with Heidegger as far as we could without being completely stilted and incomprehensible in English, and to be consistent in the rendering of his terminology, but also to be respectful of all the progress that had been made in English language scholarship in thinking through how to render Heidegger's key philosophical concepts so that people could pick up this book and have it be coordinated with other translations, with scholarly interpretation, and so on.
Thank you both very much. I mean, you've essentially answered my second question as well, which was this ethics of translation, this, you know, between interpretation and literalness. So so thank you very much. I think I'll just then open the floor to questions. Lawrence has been waving much like he did in Boston.
Wasn't waving. I was very happy to. It's just I thought if I take my hand down, how do I get it back up again? Or you know,
the eternal question. Lawrence, your question.
Well, I mean, I had two. One is a point, and that is to thank you both, because without your hard work, this reading group would not have been possible. And it's been an excellent translation to work from, and so we owe you a lot in opening a door for this to happen.
Thank you.
And I particularly take my hat off to Richard, who's been kind enough to turn up and listen. And it's often me who says, you know, I'm not sure if I would entirely agree with this translation, but I've tried to make clear that that is not meant to be taken as a transcendental point, a judgment, as it were, but rather simply to open the questions up, because we're not in the business, as it were, of providing a second critique of the translation. The question is, exactly as you've said, Greg, to open up what lies between the translation and the German as a way in for us. And so again, I want to reiterate, I think Aaron's and mine, probably I hope the whole group's heartfelt thanks to you for making this possible, because I'm not sure that we could have done what we've done with Manheim's translation. And that was the second point I wanted to make. I mean, I've written about this, that I think the order in which Heidegger was published and the order in which he was translated have profoundly affected the way he's been interpreted. And that's something I don't think that will be unraveled in anyone here's lifetime. But it will unravel slowly. But I know one of the things that Aaron and I have learned from the translating work that we're doing at the moment is the extent to which, and this kind of work's only become possible in recent years, but the extent to which one of the accusations against Heidegger is a coiner of neologisms. And it turns out, well, he does coin neologisms, but far more rarely than we thought. A lot of terms that looked like neologisms that I was taught by Macquarie, I was taught by Krell, by Robert Bernasconi, were neologisms, have turned out to be nothing of the sort. I mean, I always assumed that ontotheology was a word of Heidegger's own creation. It's not. It comes straight from Kant. At least Kant uses it with a familiarity that suggests that it could even have been around before him, although I've never been able to track it back. And then there are these words like sein, which turn out not to be Heidegger's invention at all. I initially traced it back to Natorp, but in fact, you can find it right at the beginning of the 19th century with people like Zeller. But that kind of work of resituating Heidegger back into the discourse from which he springs, I think is in its infancy. And one of my own worries is, as interest in language wanes, especially, I mean, my own country is very guilty of not learning languages very well in order to read stuff. And with the prevalence of English, which I think has got nothing to do with Britain and more to do with your own good country, you know, as a central point of linguistic exchange, that's making things harder. My question is, why the second revision? Because I have compared the two. They're not hugely different. I get that the second one is essentially much more like a translation of the Gesamtausgabe volume. And so there are incredibly important additions there. There are the editor's comments and so on. But I mean, I wondered if there had been any other prompt apart from simply wanting to, let's say, bring it a little up to date and bring it in line with the Gesamtausgabe edition.
Well, we were approached by Yale. I don't think this was our idea.
No.
They said, would you be interested in doing this? And since we did have the opportunity to include the Gesamtausgabe material, it seemed like a good thing to do. I don't know that we would have done it just in order to polish the text a little bit, but it was a good chance to make it a little bit more readable and fix a few errors. There was one passage where he was using an idiom, that whole estate passage, you know, the thing looks right, it fits, it stands. We were struggling with that. And finally, we consulted a native German speaker and really rewrote that sentence. But there was very little such rewriting. So I would say it's polishing of the main text and then the addition of the good appendices and editors afterward from the GA.
And also the opportunity to clarify in our footnotes what were later interpolations and what were contemporary ones.
Well, we did that in the first edition too, though.
Did we? I
Yeah.
didn't have it with me here at the office, so I wasn't sure.
Yeah, there's this constant refrain, you know, in parentheses in the 1953 edition, which I think has been mocked by some people. But actually, that gets to a translation issue that's rather important in Manheim. In Heidegger's little preface, there's the word Ausarbeitung, and Manheim translates that as reworked. So he takes it to mean that in the 50s, Heidegger, you know, did some major rewriting. And we interpret it a little uncertainly to mean that he really wrote this out in 1935 and that he's made just a few little adjustments since then. And it's important because that helps you decide, you know, what is from the 30s and what's from the 50s. Those are very different moments. And it seems that Heidegger was not quite consistent and frankly not quite honest about what he had changed in the 50s.
Larry.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I too really appreciate your translation. I will take some credit. There was a missing knot in your first translation that I caught. But you know, I think it's not getting any better. Some of the recent translations of Heideggerian words are really driving me crazy. When I was teaching, if there was a key term, I would tell them, well, it's what I think the German meaning is, or Heidegger's German meaning is, and then leave it untranslated. And that there was a certain virtue of the foreignness of the word that you could sort of acclimate yourself to the meaning, which would be, well, at least this was my experience. I was wondering if you, what you thought about this. Sometimes leaving it in German has a certain virtue once you're acclimated to the meaning.
Yeah, in teaching, I think that's true.
I think that's true for teaching, and I agree with it. I think if you're teaching Heidegger, especially to students who are new to him or even advanced ones, if there's a word like Ereignis, which is so bitterly disputed on how to translate it, or the Gestell, keeping it in the German once one has addressed what those complications are, I think is a good pedagogical move. But obviously it's not a good translator's move, because that can then proliferate to the point at which you don't really have an English translation anymore. You have a kind of mishmash. So I think it also points to a problem of going on beyond Heidegger. If to understand Heidegger, we have to make this kind of Creole language between English and Heidegger's German, not even German, it's very hard for me to imagine that the community of philosophy can ever really move forward with Die Sache des Denkens that Heidegger has brought before us, because we'll be so wedded to this kind of creolization of Heidegger that we won't move forward with the phenomenology. And that's why I think the meta translation is so important. How do we get in our own languages to the point where we can discuss these issues in a way that sounds fluent and powerful in our own languages and is not a form of Heideggerese? We may be very far from doing that, but I do think that that ultimately needs to be the goal for the sake of the thinking itself. And again, this is not an issue for scholarly translators, but it is an issue that philosophically arises for me as a scholarly translator. And I don't know if how that sits with you, Larry, but that's how
Well,
I rip
don't you
off
think
of your point.
Don't you think that a translator's note can accomplish something of what a classroom can do?
Oh, yes, sure. But that's purely for the study of that author's text and that author's ideas. How do we get Heidegger's ideas into an English that speaks in English and moves the Sache forward in our language so that we don't have to rely on Heidegger all the time? I have nothing against reading Heidegger very carefully and taking him very seriously as his own author. But there is a danger that we create a hermetic world of Heidegger discussion that is unable to engage the wider philosophical community. Unfortunately, that means we need writers of the genius of Heidegger in English or in French or in Spanish or what have you to do the meta translation of what Die Sache is into their own languages. And then you're no longer doing translations of Heidegger, you're doing your own work in the spirit of that ongoing conversation. And I think the sheer difficulty of translating Heidegger ought to be pushing us and inspiring us to try to do that.
Yeah, and so now we're talking about more than just translation. In translation, we
Yes.
want to be very faithful to the German, as long as while avoiding unnecessary awkwardness. But then when we write our own philosophy, we shouldn't be using words like originary and in itself, out of itself, standing there. And I think we just need to look to models in English of the rare people who can find the resources in the English language. And that has to be somebody on the level of Shakespeare or Emerson who can really find these wonderful connections and creative new ways of pointing at the issue.
So Heidegger went to Hölderlin or to Eckhart in the German language to inspire him to think in ways that went beyond the philosophical tradition in his language. I think to do what Heidegger did in English or in Chinese or whatever you want, there's only so far you can go with even the very best translating skills in getting the matter for thought across in a new context. And so this is this is why I call it meta translation. It's translating the question and the ability to address the question in a new language. It's not about word for word translation of a specific author at all anymore. It's doing what he did in one's own context. Reading Emily Dickinson or Shakespeare or Emerson or Thoreau and finding the power of our native language to get at the problems that we can share in this meta translation of Heidegger, if that makes sense to folks. And I'm just
of course.
speaking for English there.
Is
Right,
there
this is an international group. I see there are people from Turkey and Georgia and China and Italy, and you have to find your own models. There's a very good question in the chat here from Yuchi Zhang. Is this less rigorous English translation of Heidegger's work perhaps more in line with Heidegger's intentions, as is his own translation of Greek thought? And so what Greg's been talking about right now is as meta translation is not what we usually think of as translation, but thinking in a way that learns from Heidegger, draws from Heidegger, but is thinking in one's own native language. And I think that is sort of what he did with his quote translations of the Greek.
Yeah.
So I think that's true. However, when we were going to do a translation in the narrow sense of Heidegger, we did not want to play that game, right? We did not want to deviate very far from what he wrote. There are some people who deviate. I would say, for instance, Imad and Mali in the first translation of the Beiträge, they feel pretty free to change the grammar and swap words around and invent new words, and we were not comfortable with that.
No, I wouldn't be comfortable doing that, but I don't think that was a successful effort, although I applaud the sense of freedom that they brought. But I think for an effort like that to be successful, it really has to work in the target language. It can't be so alien to the target language that it doesn't sound like the target language at all. Their translation is much less English than Heidegger's Beiträge was German. There's another hand up now, Antoine.
Sorry, I was muted. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to do that, but I would like to ask about some of your other translations, mostly about the Plato, well, the Sein und Wahrheit, GA 3637, from which I have greatly benefited. It seems that there are passages where Heidegger is, well, one thing that we've been constantly discussing here in this reading group is the notion of presence. And oh, they're gone. Oh, they're getting the books. Good. Yeah. So that this difficult notion to translate, this notion of, well, and to understand, this notion of presence, sometimes it comes up in various synonymous words in Heidegger's German, And then you had the challenge, I suppose, to account for the same idea with 3 different kind of words. Remember one passage where there's like, I think there's Präsenz and Gegenwart and Anwesenheit and Anwesend in like the same sentence or something like that. So I guess you had to be kind of crafty. I remember reading your translation and saying, well, I would have liked to have a parenthesis with the German there. Because I know you have a glossary at the end, but I don't think it captures all the things that you've done with this. So I was just wondering how you feel about sometimes, maybe, I guess that's in a spirit of Larry's question, sometimes translating, but indicated immediately what the German is so that we can see what's going on. Because you also said that you tried to be as consistent as possible. And that's not always possible. For instance, you translate Anwesenheit sometimes as presence, which I would think is the right translation, sometimes as presentness. And my feeling is that the only reason why you would translate it as presentness is just because in the same sentence or in the same paragraph or really nearby, there are other German words to capture a similar idea. So I mean, I'm also supposing that sometimes your editors have to prevent you from doing certain things, or were you
No,
completely
the editors did not involve themselves at all. The only people you have to worry about is the Heidegger family and the Heidegger estate.
Yeah, but they didn't review things on this detail either. So I'm looking at the glossary and being in truth, and we must have missed some cases of Anwesenheit because we only list presentness.
Yeah,
So
that's not what you translated as presence abundantly in the book.
Yeah, and that
So-
could be that may be our mistake. So maybe we need a
Yeah.
second edition.
I've promised to write a short book for this Cambridge Elements Heidegger series on Heidegger on presence. So I'm going to be working on that, and I'm developing a list of all the different words. And there's Anwesenheit, Anwesen, Anwesung, Anhyphenwesung, Präsenz, Gegenwart, and you sometimes just have to make some arbitrary decisions as to how you're going to translate those in English. But consistency is desirable for sure, and sometimes you do need to insert the German, although that can be overdone.
Yeah, I think we made a pretty conscious decision to very rarely do that in Being in Truth, just because it is an imposition on the reader. And the careful scholar like you then just needs to learn German, or at least have enough German to be able to track it down. So I think we did the parenthetical work more in Introduction to Metaphysics than we did in Being in Truth. That's just my immediate sense, but I could be wrong.
I had a question about accessibility, because it's something I'm thinking a lot about, especially as Lawrence and I move forward with GA78, and I suppose it's who you consider to be your target audience when you're translating and how accessible it should be. And I'm thinking, there's no easy Heidegger text, but some perhaps lend themselves more to a general readership. Something like maybe the question concerning technology. You might see that on, I don't know, in a normal bookstore as a philosophy book to pick up. And some people might think Introduction to Metaphysics would fit that because of the title, whereas as we're discovering, it's really bloody difficult. You've got every section you go through, there's a bit of Hegel there, there's a bit of Hölderlin, there's a bit of Kant. Oh, here's some Nietzsche. And they're buried beneath the text. And Lawrence often and Richard as well often pick up on this stuff for us. So my question is then, how do you then unpack what Heidegger is trying to say? And you've touched on this as well with your example of how you change from originary to original. How do you unpack that given the variety of readers, scholarly, general, in between, that you're going to get, especially because if any German person picks up Heidegger, they're going to really struggle with that German because it's not what they're going to be used to reading. So, and Heidegger crams his German with so much meaning, and we bounce between texts to try and figure out what Heidegger's trying to do at different times with certain words, especially with something like Das Sein or Das Seiende. you know, as we translate GA78, we're constantly asking ourselves, should it be what is? Should it be being with a small b? Should it be what is present? How do we understand that in relation to das Sein? How do we understand das Sein and das Sein in relation to das Sein? So I just wondered how you approached with all of your translations this question of accessibility in relation as well to just how difficult Heidegger's German is for a German reader.
Yeah,
I guess,
you
yeah,
can
go ahead,
start.
Greg.
Go ahead, Richard. I would say
yeah,
it's a Three Stooges moment, as I call it. So I have two audiences in mind. One is the specialist scholar who really knows the material, and the other is the students in the course of that specialist scholar. So I want the specialist scholar to feel confident that our translation is one that cleaves to fidelity, but I want that scholar's students to be able to pick up the work and read it for a course that scholar is teaching and not be so mystified that they can't learn. And that maybe a student who's not in a course, but who has done work in the field could pick up, and they're not expert in Heidegger yet, but they can then understand the book. And if they want to understand better, well, then they need to learn German. That's how I think of it. It's a balancing act, but that's how I think about it. If you get so specialized that only the people on this Zoom chat can understand what's going on in your translation, I think that's going too far.
That's well put. You do sort of construct an audience as you write anything, right? I think Greg's idea of two levels of audience is very well put. I'll also mention just the statistical, factual issue of how many people are buying Heidegger translations. Now, Introduction to Metaphysics is one of his most famous books, and it's sometimes assigned in courses and so on. But Amazon has a feature called BookScan, so I can tell how many copies are selling. Most weeks, this book sells 0 to 5 copies. Once in a while, at the beginning of a semester, there's it shoots up to 20 or 30. Somebody assigned it in one class. And then something like Being in Truth, or our other the very political translation, Nature, History, State, even though they're very important for judging Heidegger's political thought, they hardly sell any copies whatsoever. I mean, over a year, they might sell 5 copies. Nobody's buying these. So just keep in mind that your main audience is yourselves. You are the ones who are learning Heidegger at a wonderful level of detail by doing this work. And you have to find satisfaction in that. And then in the occasional event like this, where a tiny fraction of the world's educated population comes together to actually read this stuff.
Yeah, and we had, there is an economics of publishing these kinds of books. For the most part, we scholars don't have to worry about it. But the reason that a publishing house can publish books like these is because when they first come out, libraries all over the world will buy them. And that's how they pay for us to do the work of the scholarship. So for the most part, the majority of these books are going onto library shelves in university collections.
Yeah. If they're even going onto shelves, because often libraries just buy a digital copy.
Yeah, that's
and also,
right.
By hook or by crook, a PDF of the book somehow gets out there on the internet within a week. And then a lot of people, very understandably, are just downloading the PDF for free.
I'm going to go to, thank you very much. I'm going to go to Alberto just because Lawrence has already asked one, and then I'll go to Lawrence after. Alberto, you're on mute.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Richard and Greg. I mean, I admire the translation and I have benefited immensely from it. And I have a question for you, which has been bugging me, which is, did you pay, when you were translating, did you pay any attention to the difference of what could have been meant in 1935 and of what could have been meant in 1953. For instance, I think that the example, Richard, that you brought up on the attack on Nietzsche, right? The notion of the attack on Nietzsche might have made sense in 1935, but in 1953, perhaps Heidegger would not have used the same word attack, since his relationship with Nietzsche would have changed along those, in those 20 years. So, in other words, this historical gap between the first and the second edition, did you pay attention to that, and did it influence your translation?
I can't say that we really consider that, except for the things that were insertions or seemed to be insertions from 1953. So in general, we took ourselves to be trying to capture what Heidegger did in 1935, although, the text was changed, it was tweaked here and there. He says he polished it, and that's understandable. And then the whole thing begins with the warning, which Manheim kind of very blandly translates as there's a difference between the spoken and the printed word. And we translated it more literally as what was spoken speaks no longer in what is printed. So you do lose the whole performance, rhetoric, and I wish we had a video of Heidegger's delivering these very dramatic lectures in 1935. But insofar as you can tell the mood and the sense of it from just the text, that's what we tried to do.
Yeah, Alberto, I think the question you ask is a very good one, but I do think it's a question for scholarship and scholarly comment more than it is for translation. It's just, I could imagine the possibility that sometimes that would matter, but it would be very hard to track through the translation. I will mention something, though, that I failed to mention in our discussion of how we worked on our translation of Introduction to Metaphysics, which is that we did consult throughout the process, especially the first time around, Italian, Spanish, and French translations of the German to see how other languages were accomplishing their renderings of especially difficult passages, but also just of individual words. So we really tried very hard to triangulate or quadrilateralate the languages, at least the Indo-European languages that have been used to translate Heidegger. Anna Rita, you asked a very interesting question about Heidegger's use of language and, for example, how some of that language shows up and shapes even children's literature and how Heidegger might be playing with that. Boy, again, it's a really good question. And if I had grown up bilingual, I would be able to be a better translator. But those are the kinds of questions that you have to be so drenched in both languages to deal with, that was beyond my capacity. But I'm sure there's elements of that in the text that we were missing.
Lawrence? You're also on mute, Lawrence.
It's really following on from Greg's comment there. I mean, I can think, for instance, of Heidegger in 2 or 3 places traces the use of Ereignis back to Eckhart. And it took me 2 or 3 years to find where that was, because I thought I knew my way around the Kohlhammer edition. Well, of course, it's not in the Kohlhammer edition. In fact, in one place, I finally found the reference, and that's to some sermons that were published separately and privately. So they were in a very small edition, which also took me forever to track down. And my Middle High German is, let's say, it's not what it once was, or it's not even what it once was. So I'm still not entirely sure, except that it's clear from Heidegger's comment and from what Eckhart is talking about, that it's Aristotle who is in view. But what I wanted to comment on was the point that in a way translation has to also to be left to its own fate, like any written work. I mean, there is only so much that one can do, and that's a point I find myself making to people I'm studying with, PhD students, and when I was teaching undergrads as well, that i.e. you get out what you, well, I suppose you get out what you put in, but if you, there is, a translation is always pitched, as it were, to the middle, to the 2/3, to the upper third of the class, rather than to the ones at the very top, because it has to be intelligible to the wider audience. Otherwise, it's not helping anyone. And in fact, those at the top, one has decisively to say, you are bright enough to go and get the German text. And even if you haven't got German, just work this out word by word with a grammar, and you will get far more than if you don't do that. And if you don't put that work in, you will make mistakes. And that's where I'd want to echo what Larry's been saying. I've been asked to comment on 2 recent Heidegger translations. And there's a kind of playfulness that's creeping into translations. I mean, publishers in particular are going for slightly quicker and dirtier translations than they used to. They are allowing less time for translations to take place. And there is something about slightly sensational translations, and I'm not going to name any names, but I think, for instance, some of the more recent translations of Spruch are simply unsupportable. And there is a Heidegger constituency that loves the sort of mystical Dr. Seuss level of when language that Heidegger's turned into a kind of pseudo-mysticism, which he himself detested and spoke against frequently. And that, I think, is something that we have to be aware of, that translators themselves can be lured by publishers into working too quickly. I mean, the translation, not of Heidegger, that Bogdan is here today, and I worked on, took 8 years and was actually, frankly, hell. I mean, it was just hell, because there was no previous template for that translation. There was nothing we could refer to help us, except the Italian and the French translations, which the original text had commented on. And in some places we could see that, for instance, in the French translation just couldn't work. We were trying to work out what it meant in German. The French translator couldn't work it out either. So as far as I can tell, he made it up, which it's more difficult to get away with a good scholarly press these days. And that's why I've found this translation of yours and both of yours is so enormously helpful, because it does steer a very clear and firm, admittedly middle way, but that's because that's the best. It's not. There's no deficiency in that at all. Quite the reverse. It's enormously helpful to everybody. Your translation opens doors to students, to teachers, and to others, and that's why it's been such a pleasure to use it, and why we're very grateful to you for coming and speaking to us today.
Well, that's very kind, thanks. And of course, now speaking of speed, there's a question of AI, and I've actually heard about somebody who's putting up unauthorized Heidegger quote translations on Amazon, and I think he's just taken the digital German text, run it through AI, maybe tweaked it here and there, and turned it into a quote book. And I'm sure these are disasters, but this is gonna complicate the whole question of philosophical interpretation, at least for those who are naive enough to use these translations.
There was a big debate on the classics listserv recently, because there was someone working on an AI program asking people who've done Latin translations and published them to contribute to helping this AI program work out. And it's just like, you're not asking the right people here. These people who've made their living doing these translations, and you're suggesting, well, why don't we just override that and give it to AI? Bogdan, could I ask you to be very, very quick, just because we've come to the end of time now?
Yeah, no, I understood, and I'll shut up then.
No, if you could, if it's a short question, that's absolutely fine.
No, it's just the simplest question of all. There is a problem about as Richard, it's so nice to see you after so many years, and thank you so much. But Greg, to meet you, one of the things about this text is that it contains in its passages that have extraordinary power to explain the world today, and yet it is extremely hard to convey them, because as soon as you allow the text to emerge, because you want people to read more than the passage that you think speaks to the condition of the world. One of the questions that I had, and it comes from Alberto's question as well, to what extent the 1930s, do you think now, because you've read it now, you know where the world is now, you've translated it now, you fought with it, to what extent do you think this is a text that is legible in terms of the contemporary crisis of thought nearly 100 years later, 91 years later?
I mean, to me, it still feels very fresh, and some parts are almost futuristic, like when he's talking about how any incident you like, anywhere you like, can be made accessible as fast as you like. I mean, this was not literally true in 1935. Now it's literally true, and there's an allusion there to the assassination of the King of Yugoslavia in Marseille, which was then put onto newsreels and shown in theaters. And now you can go to YouTube, plug in a few of those words, and boom, there it is. So he really anticipated, in some ways, the 21st century.
It's those 4 episodes of the darkening of the world which I find extraordinarily compelling.
Yeah.
If people can't see the world today as that, you got to be blind. The question is, am I dogmatic? Because I think I understand so much about what is happening to us today through that, especially through the flight of the triumph of mediocrity, or the preeminence of the mediocre, whichever way you want to translate it. Those things are so extraordinary, and there's 2 places in which he mentions them. Just reading those and trying to get the nuance, this section 50. This is the other question about translation, but that's technical, and I will shut up. Why didn't you put the section titles in the translation? Why are they absent? You see what I mean?
Well, those are not due to Heidegger. Those are due to the editor of the Gesamtausgabe.
Mm.
So we put them at the beginning of the volume. That's why we kept them there. As far as the Heidegger as a diagnostician of the contemporary world, I think he's very powerful, but I also want to resist that a little bit, because I think you see this very much in the Black Notebooks, that he has this stratospheric view. And yes, it's very illuminating at a general level, but at the same time, he's really not paying attention to concrete individuals or historical events or political tensions. And he's sort of, it's a typical philosopher's naivete and coldness. And I wouldn't want to lose my feel for the concrete and the unpredictable.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, I think we've come to the end of our sessions today. I think I speak for everybody here when I express my deepest gratitude to Richard and Greg for coming today and sharing their experiences of translating this really tremendous text, and a terrific translation. That's, as Lawrence has said, it's been so helpful with going back to GA55, GA35, our previous reading groups. This is much more clearer, and I think one of the points of accessibility there is providing the German in the English as frequently as you do, which gives the reader the opportunity to, really think through how you've translated it and what Heidegger means. So thank you very much. Oh, I think Greg was possibly saying something, but on mute.
Oh, it's kind of you to ask. I was just saying, I agree that there is tremendous power in this book, both in its analysis of the most ancient texts to its insights about what is happening at the global level. But I do agree with Richard that Heidegger, even though in many ways he's the philosopher of the radically concrete, I think because he flies at 50,000 feet, he's right that there are some terrible things going on in the globalization of information and mediocrity and so on. But it does mean, I think, that he misses some of the potential that is going on at the very surface of the world, despite these trends, and even maybe because of these trends. And there's a kind of Olympian disdain that I think handicaps him from seeing all of the phenomena. It reminds me a bit of how Adorno despised jazz. How can you despise jazz? It's just madness. And so I think one has to just engage Heidegger in very serious dialogue and recognize that as brilliant as he was, he had his serious blind spots. And that's always been very important to me in teaching my students, to be open to his tremendous insight, but also to recognize that he is not a prophet and he can miss things too.
Indeed. I think the same. It's just a pity that sometimes the sides are taken, either he's a prophet or he's not a prophet, or he's completely wrong, and the middle ground is lost. As you said, the debate is not moving on. It's just stuck to some extent in one of those.
And that's why I think that
Bogdan,
those of us who love this material have to think in our own language, in our own personal idioms, about how to convey these questions and these problems for our students and for our communities in ways that speak to them. And that's an enormous challenge. But ultimately, I think that's what Heidegger is asking us to do in our own way, if we want to be concrete about our own historicity.
And with that, thank you. Sorry, Richard.
Well, there are a couple of questions in the chat. I'll answer super fast. Natalia, yes, we did sometimes divide long sentences. And Axel, we have not thought about retranslating Unterwegs zur Sprache. That would be a really hard one, but what an interesting idea.
Something for Axel to do, maybe. Well, thank you again, both Richard and Greg, and thank you everyone for contributing to such an incredible discussion. It's been really insightful. Thank you very much. See you all next week. Thank you.
We're very honored. Thank you.
Good one. Thank you.